with all the focus on emerging technology, I probably should have more focus on light technology within my own office, but.
All right, 1 o'clock. Ann, are we live?
Yes.
All right, perfect. All right, welcome everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to the American Bar Association Administrative Law and Regulatory Practice Section Transportation Committee's Emerging Technology Seminar. I'm Timothy Tenney, the Deputy Chair for the committee, and I'll be your moderator today. Thank you for joining us. And before we begin, I'd like to bring up one rule for the seminar for our attendees. If you have a question, please post it in the chat area. And at the end of the seminar, if we have time, I'll present them to the panel for discussion. Without further ado, given our short time together, let's get started by introducing our panelists. We're honored today to have two of the nation's leaders in multimode transportation regulation as our panelists. I'd like to introduce John Putnam. John was confirmed by the U.S. Senate on May 12, 2022, and sworn in as General Counsel of the U.S. Department of Transportation. He joined the Biden administration as the department's Deputy General Counsel on January 20th, 2021. In this role, he works closely with the department's senior leadership and nearly 500 attorneys to manage legal and policy matters concerning all of the department's operating administrations. Next, I'd like to introduce Allison Fultz. Allison is Chief Counsel for the Federal Railroad Administration. She is the principal legal advisor to the agency and leads FRA's staff of legal professionals. Allison joined the FRA from private practice, where she focused on transactional and regulatory matters related to transportation infrastructure projects. Prior to entering the practice of law, Allison was a registered architect and designed and directed construction projects and feasibility studies for projects in the United States and Canada. Welcome to our panelists. All right, let's get started with a strategic question to the panel for both John and Allison on regulating for innovation and how innovation fits into regulatory programs and framework. Given the rapid pace that innovation is impacting all of the modes of transportation with technologies such as autonomy, artificial intelligence, sensors, and other, can each of you give your perspective on the role of the department to manage, integrate, or coordinate in this area, especially as it pertains to balancing safety while also supporting our U.S. industrial base? Let's start off with John.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Thank you for hosting and moderating the seminar. Thanks to the ABA for hosting, and thanks for everybody. Looks like about 81 folks who have joined us this afternoon. Just a real quick disclaimer. DOT has 9 operating administrations and also regulatory activities for the Office of Secretary as well. So we cover all those. We're not going to hit them all in an hour. And we don't have all of the operating administrations. We're lucky to have Federal Railroad Administration here, but don't have FAA, NHTSA, some of the others who are really at the kind of pointy end of the sphere on a lot of those issues. So we'll do the best to provide some of the big picture principles, and also because we're a federal agency, can't get ahead of where the White House or regulatory process may be. But this is an administrative law and regulatory practice session, so I think many of you already know that. So to your question, Tim, innovation is actually one of the 5 guiding policy principles of this administration and of Secretary Buttigieg. And so it's a critical part of our formulation for where we look for either filling in gaps to the extent that there may be a safety deficit, providing a framework to the extent that's what's needed to move a promising technology forward. And a lot of it really depends on the particular issue in terms of how it's framed up. But you mentioned safety, as we will say perhaps too many times and yet not enough. Safety is the North Star of the Department of Transportation. It's kind of the original purpose of why we're here, the structure of many of the laws that we deal with, whether it's the Federal Aviation Act or the Vehicle Safety Act, is really to ensure safety in the transportation system. So we take that as a non-negotiable kind of first place that we start from. But from there, we also have policy priority for economic strength. We want to win the 21st century. Innovative technology is a critical way to do that, either offensively, because we want to make sure that the United States is well positioned with drone technology, with leak detection and repair technology, with vehicle technology, but also defensively to make sure that we are protected against threats, cybersecurity, safety-related concerns, terrorism, other sort of issues that we may have. Also see, equity as a critical function that we have, and we need to make sure as we move into the 20th century that we make sure that the benefits and burdens of technology are evenly felt. We'll use an example of automated vehicles. Currently, tens of millions of Americans don't have the ability to drive by themselves. They may be elderly, they may be disabled, they may be young. There's opportunity with AV technology to address some of those issues that we wouldn't have with more traditional technology. That has to be balanced off against all the other considerations. And then obviously, environmental sustainability and climate has to be a critical focus as we move forward, given the crisis that we're in right now. So we look at all of those when we set our regulatory agenda, when we identify which rules we're ready to move forward on. As an example, advanced air mobility is a priority for the Federal Aviation Administration because they need the framework for the new electric vertical and takeoff and landing or powered lift aircraft to really move forward in that area. We'll talk a little bit more about drones or UAS later in that same category to be able to move forward in those areas so they become a focus. A couple other just quick thoughts, and then I'll turn it over to Allison. That one size doesn't fit all with advanced technology. It kind of covers every operating mode, everything that we do, and there are big differences in the legal structure that we're subject to. Vehicle Safety Act, sets up a much more responsive approach where we wait and see if there are defects that reflect an unreasonable risk to safety, and then we'll look at using recall authority through NHTSA to deal with those issues, as opposed to federal aviation that requires prior certification, prior access to the National Aviation Airspace System. And that creates fundamentally different kind of background that we have to work up. The technology is different. The modes are different. The challenge of, for example, autonomy in airspace in the first 1,000 feet is fundamentally different from a crowded city street, which is different from a railroad, which is different from a rural highway. And we have to address all of those situations. And so the kind of how we do that regulation will change. And I think recognizing we're not alone here. DOT has many of the tools, but not all of the tools. Increasingly, as we look at a more connected society, the security agencies, when we're looking at, for example, drone technology or cybersecurity issues, DHS, Department of Justice, DOD have a lot to say, and we have to work through those issues. The Federal Communications Commission has a lot to say with kind of communications and connected issues, and we have to work through all of those issues. So increasingly, we're having to play ball with many others. That includes states, localities, the private sector, obviously. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think the other place I think that's important in this area is where we need hard legal authority and where, for example, we're also trying to achieve other aims, whether that's controlling liability costs, whether that's addressing preemption issues, or even providing the social license to operate. With a number of these emerging technologies, there's incredible opportunity to achieve great things, whether it be safety, economic, access, other sort of pieces. But it just takes one accident, one disaster that may tarnish and set an industry back a far ways. And so I think there's a push-pull between wanting to move quickly, husband the scarce capital and other sort of resources that new entrants may have, and yet not move so fast that you may create a industry damaging and certainly public damaging areas. I think former FAA acting administrator Billy Nolan captured it well in a meeting that he had with the drone industry earlier this year, where he said, and I'll paraphrase, "We don't want to slow your roll, but we do want to make sure that your roll is safe." And that's really, I think, kind of captures what we're trying to do. And it's easier to say that than achieve it in reality, but it is a pretty good encapsulation of the overall strategy. And with that, I'll hand it over to Allison.
Sure. Thanks, John. And Tim, thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with everybody today. I just want to emphasize a couple of themes and points that you heard John make. First and foremost is safety, which really is the lens through which we view all other proposals and activities and efforts. And as with any regulatory endeavor, balancing is really the key to it. And because of the uniqueness of each of the operating modes, you're going to have different factors that influence how that balance plays out. And safety always, for those musicians out there, safety is always your ground base. And on top of that sort of constant holding everything together, you have the various other themes that contribute and are competing and need to be resolved within the regulatory effort and sort of as part of the view towards the public interest, the advancement of technology. That really is the role of the government in all of this. So I think with that, I'll turn it over for the next question.
Great, and perfect. We'll stay with you, Allison, then we'll move back on to John. But with that wonderful locomotive photo in the background, we're going to move on to railroads and regulatory standardization regarding automated sensor and emerging technologies for track safety. So our next question, given the recent focus of train derailments, along with railroads struggling to recruit and retain experienced personnel, what priorities in rulemaking or other is the Federal Railroad Administration taking regarding implementing emerging technologies such as automated sensors and other systems to monitor and increase track safety?
So I think this really will continue the themes of both safety and balancing. You will hear us say repeatedly that safety is our North Star for evaluating all innovative technologies. And so in line with the DOT innovation principles, FRA is proceeding on a number of fronts. And one mechanism that is essential to our task there is our Railroad Safety Advisory Committee. You'll hear me refer to it as RSAC. And that is a body of subject matter experts from across the industry, including from the railroads, from labor organizations, manufacturers, who study specific technical elements and questions and provide advice on potential rulemaking efforts. So one way in which questions come to RSAC, for instance, in the context of the wake of the East Palestine derailment, is that the question of wayside detectors, what they are, what they do, how we should regulate them, is part of that discussion. And so RSAC has taken up a study of wayside detectors in order to do a full evaluation of how those devices are used, how they could be used, and then to come up with recommendations for potential rulemaking or other activities in connection with that technology. It's kind of a funny example because it's not necessarily cutting edge technology, but it's technology that has existed in the rail industry for decades and is constantly evolving and constantly developing and being refined. And so in light of some of the facts that have come out, as you heard in the NTSB hearings a couple of weeks ago, RSAC has taken up the question of wayside detectors and how best to view them. Some other topics that are currently under review by RSAC are modern braking technologies, which include electronically controlled pneumatic brakes, and other kind of cross-cutting industry-wide questions. We've also asked RSAC to consider alternative track inspection methodologies and to examine if those meet or exceed the minimum levels of safety that are currently established in FRA's track safety standards and regulations. And so these technologies would include automated track inspection and autonomous track geometry measurement systems. And a note here, as with much of what we'll be talking about today, the discussion often centers around what's the best way to preserve or enhance safety, and at the same time to enhance human capacities through the application of new technology. And so this really is sort of the leading edge of the balancing test as we look at new technologies.
Great.
I do want to point out just a couple more points here.
Sure, absolutely.
In recognition of the industry's efforts to develop new technology in support of safety and efficiency improvements, FRA created the Engineering, Technology, and Automation Division of our Office of Railroad Systems and Technology. So FRA has a significant role in research in the industry, and as well, we have a test facility in Pueblo, Colorado, where we test new technologies. We've got test tracks. The Japanese Shinkansen train was tested there in the early 1960s. And it's sort of a jewel in the crown at DOT that is not widely known to the public, but is something it's a facility that's available to do extensive testing in precisely the kind of technologies that we're talking about.
Great. Thank you, Allison. John, anything to add?
The only thing I would add, Tim, to Allison's excellent presentation is sometimes the kind of use of research or grant programs like the bipartisan infrastructure law or other sort of pieces can help achieve regulatory aims beyond the traditional notice and comment rulemaking, for a rule that may find its way into CFR. So the application of those principles, enforcement, other sort of tools, guidance, sharing of knowledge, holding of hands can often be a rapid way of achieving some of those aims. And so, when we think about our suite of regulatory tools, it's not just a kind of traditional notice and comment rulemaking, go through the Federal Register, go to OIRA, and then find yourself in the CFR. It's part of a package of programs that get us to, hopefully the environment that we're looking for that is both protective and supportive of emerging technology.
And some of the things that both you and Allison just mentioned are, foundational and benchmarks for all the modes. Talking about the test center there in Pueblo, Colorado for Department of Transportation, Federal Railroad Administration. We've got the tech center in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and Oklahoma City for the FAA, and similar to other modes. So I think within the purview of the Department of Transportation, other agencies might be able to garner some of the foundational concepts that we have being able to share between the modes. And I think that theme will be throughout the questions that we're talking about today as well. So let's stay on the rails, and we'll have another question with regards to railroads, and it'll be with regards to positive train control. So now that the industry, and we'll start off with Allison on this, now that the industry and the FRA have completed the rollout of positive train control 1.0, what might we see with respect to the next generation of this great infrastructure and technology from a regulatory perspective?
Sure. And just for those who may not be as familiar with the acronyms, PTC is a GPS-based system that enables communication between a moving train, the signals at the side of the track, and the dispatching and monitoring centers that all of the railroads maintain via GPS technology in order to know in real time where a train is, how fast it's going, and whether there are hazards up ahead that may affect the train's movement. And the PTC system allows for automatic operation of the train, either to slow it or stop it in order to prevent a collision or an accident or derailment. And so this really has been a significant technological leap that was mandated in 2008 in the Rail Safety Improvement Act, and was finalized in 2020, in that by the end of 2020, all railroads who were required to install PTC had to have those systems up and running, and they met that deadline, which was a significant achievement on the part of the industry as a whole. So in 2021, PTC is up and running. we issued a final rule to streamline the process by which railroads would request and obtain FRA's approval to make material modifications to their PTC systems. Because of the unique and sort of revolutionary nature of this technology being rolled out system-wide, we knew there were going to be tweaks, and we knew that we would be learning as we went once railroads were actually using the system and seeing how it performs across the network. So the streamlined process outlines a targeted list of information that railroads must submit to FRA for our review, and it establishes a 45-day deadline for us to issue a decision. So it really is aimed at solving problems in real time, taking the questions that railroads bring to us and answering them expeditiously. So this framework, looking at modifications that railroads request, will help the industry move towards PTC 2.0. And this process really has already enabled railroads to enhance their PTC systems more efficiently. And so, for example, introducing new functionality and system improvements to the systems that they had put in place by the end of 2020. And so since January 2021, we've looked at over 50 requests, and these have been filed jointly and individually by railroads for approval to modify their PTC systems. In addition, we're looking at which PTC provisions may need amending and to help resolve certain industry challenges that are not adequately addressed by our existing PTC regulations. And again, to improve FRA's oversight of system-wide issues. So to that end, we continue to closely evaluate the railroad's quarterly reports that are required under regulation to submit on PTC system performance, and then to determine trends in system reliability and to zero in on any recurring or railroad-specific issues that require correction. So we continue to actively provide technical assistance to railroads and PTC system suppliers to help resolve present challenges and set the stage for future developments in PTC technology. So as we sit here today, I don't have a schedule for when we plan to roll that out, but we are already well along in the evaluation process to issue spot and to work with the industry on where the next generation of refinements will be needed.
Great. That was a wonderful rundown of positive train control, and very timely, I think, for the audience here, especially as rail has been kind of at the forefront of news with some accidents and incidents that have occurred with train derailments, and how this has prevented many more train derailments that are out there. John, anything to add from a perspective of maybe standardization or interoperability, and how we could leverage this infrastructure for new technologies?
So I think, a lot of the PTC focus is focused just within the rail industry and how that works. I think there are scope questions, who's covered by those requirements, how quickly, what do they have to spend? I think those are big picture questions. I might back the lens out just a little bit to, Allison started with a description. It is a GPS enabled technology. It depends on communication. All of those kind of across the technological sphere, across the government, are under threat and under challenge. So when we look at GPS, we know that there are nation state and non-nation state actors who are looking to disrupt those signals, and it is an ongoing challenge. Both the Department of Transportation and the rest of the government, and DOD at the lead on some of that, to look for ways to harden those systems, look for alternatives as backups. And then, the communications realm is tough. We, have disagreements sometimes with our sister departments about the availability of different forms and bandwidths of telecommunications that are out there. That's becoming saturated as we find more and more ways of using bandwidth, and we need to make sure that that's out there, as well as the cyber threats to all of those. This administration started pretty soon after Inauguration Day with a fundamental challenge to the Colonial Pipeline, that was brought in by a cyber attack on their system. That's not at all isolated to transportation, and certainly not isolated to pipelines. And one of the things we have to look at with every iteration of these pieces is, how we think about those emerging threats kind of from a big picture that it is absolutely critical to think through all the railroad specific PTC issues, but we have to think about a system of systems and, overall threats that we have, because we know whether it's the power grid or water systems, adversaries are looking to test us on those areas. And we need to look at that. I think that's something that goes back multiple administrations, but I think given some of the threats and the current geopolitical situation, it's something just we have to take absolutely seriously right now.
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, and then we could actually, if we had more time to get into, how our interagencies, how we could maybe do a better job between Federal Communications Agency and DOT. We just saw here in the past 6 months or a year with regards to 5G rollout with cellular companies and how that affected air traffic and the radar altimeters on aircraft, and how we can work together. And then on a positive sense, the Federal Communication Agency working with the FAA on advanced air mobility, on looking at those pieces of bandwidth that may be available to be more secure, more compliant, and more redundancy for communications with unmanned and uncrewed aircraft systems. So I think those are all great points. All right, so now that we've kind of moved into that rotation in true aviation fashion, let's rotate and move our questions into the air with an aviation related question and unmanned aircraft systems integration. So we'll start off here with John, looking at the looming FAA reauthorization and the latest draft reauthorization bills between the House and Senate. There's much language focusing on efforts to integrate unmanned, uncrewed, electric vertical takeoff and land, or eVTOL aircraft systems into our national airspace system. And one of the key components of the integration is safe and efficient beyond visual line of sight applications and advanced air mobility. So could you share with us from your perspective, what is currently being done in this area concerning rulemaking, aircraft, airman certification, and other? So I know we don't have the FAA on here, so we'll have to stay at that strategic level, but I'm sure you're very well being the General Counsel of being able to handle some of these subjects.
Thank you, Tim. I thought you were going to say you're taking us off the rails at this point. So yeah, appreciate that question. And I think it is important to start the framing of the question with the reauthorization bills, because the previous reauthorizations, have had a lot of focus, especially on the drone or UAS space. And I think a lot of interest, from Congress to find that right balance between safety and the economic opportunity that's presented by these technologies. Not at all surprised that interest persists. Certainly, I think industry groups and others have a lot of ideas. They have receptive ears on the Hill. And so, we are working through that. I'm sure many folks, and I see some of my FAA colleagues on the participant list, have been spending a lot of time working through the, hundreds of pages of reauthorization language to go through those issues. And to your question, FAA has been working hard to try to address those questions, even putting aside the reauthorization language. And kind of going back to Acting Administrator Nolan, I think at the same conference with AUVSI, that he had indicated that we have no interest in slowing people's roll. I think he also recognized that we're not moving as fast, I think, as we would like in that space, but it's also hard. So, back to my initial responses, this is a place where we need to make sure that we can safely pull all of this new technology and entirely new economic models into the airspace and do so in a safe way and in a way that's fully supported. And so when this administration started, we worked off of two rules which had just been finalized: the operations over people and the remote ID rule, and allowed those to move forward. FAA has been working to integrate those rules, but I think we knew there was more to do behind there. So a couple of key, maybe three key routes to try to address those issues. First was an aviation rulemaking committee to deal with that beyond visual line of sight issue. That committee met frequently, came out with a report. I can't say it was a consensus or perfectly clear report, but provided really good guidance that FAA has been working on. That came out last year. So just in terms of where our regulatory agenda is right now, we do have a beyond visual line of sight rule that's identified for next year's regulatory agenda. Won't get ahead of FAA in terms of the micro schedule on that issue, but it does address some of those key issues that you identified. How do we provide the rules to allow someone to operate even if they can't see the drone and maintain the kind of fundamental issue that's been a bedrock principle for FAA for years? How do you see and avoid other aircraft? Again, if safety is the first principle, we need to keep a drone, a manned aircraft, an air taxi from hitting either another object in the air or something on the ground. And that's, I think, the fundamental challenge that this BVLOS issue has addressed. So that will be a core part of that rulemaking. You had mentioned, and we had talked in the past, this concept of universal traffic management and other sort of models for addressing traffic. How do we automate some of those pieces so that it isn't just an on-aircraft person who does all that see and avoid work? But are there network systems, are there radar systems, are there other approaches, even a third-party system at the very lowest levels of altitude so that you could deconflict the UAS from helicopters or crop dusters or other sort of things at that level? And so all of that is in the regulatory information number, the RIN, in the proposed rule that FAA is working on. Informing all of that, though, and I think practically, is the so-called Beyond program that FAA is implementing. Started in late 2020 as a 4-year program. It's a successor to the so-called IPP program. Has 9 participants around the country, everywhere from state of North Dakota to the Choctaw Nation to city of Reno. And, they are really experimenting with these pieces, package deliveries, used for firefighting applications. And so they are testing, I think, in relatively controlled environments, how this see and avoid approach works with different technologies, with different geographies, with different operating models. And so working through those issues. And I think we've seen a lot of movement in terms of waivers and other FAA approvals to enable moving through that technology. That will provide the data, that will provide the concepts that I think will then inform more of a national rule. And then the final category, I think, is recognizing, which will come as a surprise to exactly nobody on an ABA administrative law conference, that doing a traditional notice and comment rule takes time. It's 18 to 24 months, for average rules. This one's probably bigger than your average rule. And so recognizing that there are a number of authorities, both within FAA regulations and by statute, including the last reauthorization, that provide FAA the tool. And so I think trying to maximize those tools to provide the waivers, tools, other sort of things to allow those beyond participants and others to move forward. And it's been a priority of both the Department of Transportation and FAA to try to accelerate that process. I think we'll often use the phrase of, trying to move from the crawl to the walk to the run. I think sometimes folks would rather be running sooner. Sometimes other folks would rather keep us crawling for longer. And we're trying to move that along as safely as possible. And I think through that, really trying to move along those pieces. And we've seen progress on that front. So the first type certification for the Matternet drone operation, I think a large number of NEPA and other sort of documents to kind of address environmental impact, noise, other sort of concerns that we are note out there would be practical limitations to the speed of implementation. Those are becoming regularized. And when you get past the first example or the second example, you've got a body of knowledge to work through. You've worked through a lot of the hard problems. And so, my hope is that we are speeding up, even if we may not be moving as fast as we had hoped. So there's a lot to do in that front. I think the next year, the next 5 years, will all be exceptionally busy, and certainly, keep your eyes on that space. Just dealing with drones, I think critical next step is FAA will be hosting a drone symposium the first week of August, where I think a lot of this information and a lot of those next steps, will be dealt with. Last thing on drones, and then I'll move on to advanced air mobility or air taxis, is, the international space. I think there's been a concern. Are the Europeans getting ahead of us? Are the Australians getting ahead of us? How do we coordinate? And FAA really has been doing a lot of work with our international partners, so that hopefully we can come up with a kind of consistent international approach, recognizing that there are differences between those countries. We have a more robust general aviation system than anywhere in the world. We probably have the most complicated airspace of anywhere in the world. And all that takes time. We work in a federal system. We work in a system governed by our own laws. And, that does take some time, but it's incredibly important to FAA, and we'll move forward. We'll also note having a confirmed FAA administrator will help, on that front, which, given all the other challenges that FAA has to deal with, it's just helpful to have that political force and vision and cover. And that's important as we move forward. So Tim, you also asked about advanced air mobility. I'm going to try to avoid using the AAM phrase, and I'll just generally say air taxis. And so for those who are less familiar with the space, I think the kind of classic example of a vehicle in the space would be a multi-rotor system that would take off probably with electricity vertically and then transition over to flying on a wing. So as a hybrid of traditional rotorcraft or helicopters and fixed wing aircraft. And there's been an incredible proliferation of technological, regulatory, and other developments in this space. And I'll mention just some because it is a priority for the Federal Aviation Administration and DOT to enable this industry. And I think a lot of things are moving back from the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics and the expectation that one and maybe two operators may be fully certified to start providing these services on a commercial basis in late 2024. And so, just to work through, just in the last week, Joby received their authority to start flying the first prototype aircraft to start testing this electric vertical and takeoff and landing approach. That's a critical step. FAA has approved the certification basis both for Joby and Archer. And, we'll be taking a look at other manufacturers coming in. This spring, they put together their advanced air mobility blueprint and submitted a implementation plan, really laying out from soup to nuts, how do you train people? How do you deal with systems? How do you deal with certification of organizations to provide commercial service? How do you deal with ground infrastructure, the so-called vertiports? How do you deal with the airspace issues, the communications issues? How do you think about over time moving from what will primarily be piloted aircraft to eventually supporting remote aircraft in the same way, a kind of big version of UAS? All of those are questions that are kind of laid out, and I think interested in taking public comment on all of those issues. At the same time that we're actually trying to make it happen in a kind of crawl to run sort of phase by having the airworthiness certificate for Joby, having some of the other sort of tools that are out there. And then an absolutely critical proposed rule that came out last month related to powered lift goes into the question of how do you certify pilots to be able to fly these? How would you actually work with these in the context of a Part 135 or under other sort of certificate? That's out for comment, so I'm not going to go into much detail and certainly can't hear too much. Encourage everybody to submit comments on that rule. But we're confident that we'll be able to pull that environment together to support the timeline that FAA has laid out, while recognizing it's going to be tough. It's not a lot of time to evolve that industry. And again, we don't want to slow the role of that industry, but at the same time, we do want to make sure when it comes out that it's safe. Because again, there's incredible promise here but that promise could be delayed or squandered if we have, a bad incident on the front end. So want to make sure that we can achieve our economic, our technological, our equity, and our safety goals at the same time.
No, fantastic. And just a couple things to add. I do want to let the audience know, John brought it up, but yes, at the end of July, beginning of August, there'll be the FAA Drone Summit and Advanced Air Mobility Summit in Baltimore at the Convention Center. Please sign up. It's the first one since COVID. So I think it'll be a great time for the industry and stakeholders to come together. And also in that same vein, you have the Aviation Rulemaking Committee on Drone Detection and Mitigation at University of Baltimore Law School. That'll have the plenary meeting there. So two great things ahead. But I really do want to keep building upon the positives, not only being an FAA alum, but some of the things that the FAA has done here in recency with putting universal templates for waivers for shielded operations, for drone as a first responder. That's groundbreaking and foundational for Department of Transportation FAA to work right alongside industry after building the safety case over the last 7 to 8 years to be able to get to where we are. So when we say, other nations may be ahead, I would say, no, they're not. We're doing it the right way, the way that we've always done it. And we're going to continue to do that 10 to the -7th. So I think you made some great points. And also for those on the attendees, one of the things that we have within our federal government, especially within DOT and the modes, are working alongside those innovating small business startup partners with small business innovation research grants and broad area announcements, and university and private industry partnerships through Kratos and other ways for us to be able to innovate. And that doesn't come without the help and support of both the Department of Transportation, our federal government, and those private stakeholders that are out there. And so I really like to bring Allison in on the question, since drones aren't just in the air, they're supporting railroads each and every day. I remember being at the FAA back when Part 107 wasn't even completed, and you had Class 1 railroads asking for 333 exemptions to be able to use drones to increase safety. So Allison, looking forward to your response.
Sure. And railroads were early adopters. As soon as the earliest versions of our current regulatory structure started to emerge, railroads were asking for really well-considered waivers to enable to use particularly beyond visual line of sight operations, and to use drones to, again, enhance human capability, to see further, to do inspections more efficiently. And so they've continued to use drones in a number of different applications, and have really branched out from what had been focused initially on monitoring trains that were in operation, and are using drones more widely to help with facilities management, and to monitor operations in yards. And in general, I think have set a good example for how an industry can adopt this technology in order to extend their view and to more efficiently gather information and process it.
Great, thank you, Allison. Do you foresee the railroad mode itself working right alongside the FAA as it's done, or do you see them kind of branching out to bring some of these innovations online? And we've had this discussion with sensors and signaling systems, et cetera.
I think at this point, because FAA has done such a good job of setting up a regulatory structure that's very adaptable, there's much less of the need for the railroad industry to be coming up with custom sort of applications that differ from the general approach. And I think what you'll probably see in the future are what particular elements or technological opportunities that drones provide can be translated into the rail industry, but not necessarily in the drone context.
No, great, well said. And I think one thing John touched on a little bit, it's not the complexity of the slowness of our apparatus of getting things done. It's just the complexity of transportation. When we look at it, we really got to think of it through three perspectives, right? So we have the operator, the pilot, the locomotive engineer, the humans that are doing the work in that transportation mode. Then we've got to actually look at the equipment. So in the railroads, we're looking at locomotives, consists, railway cars. In the aviation mode, we're looking at aircraft, whether that be rotorcraft, fixed wing, powered lift, eVTOL, or drones in the unmanned uncrewed realm. Same thing in maritime or in federal highway or motor carrier. And then we have to look at where we're operating it. You know, is it being operated in the National Airspace System on a Class 1 track or on a private road within international waters? All of those different things. And then we encapsulate that into the operation. How's it being used? So if we keep that perspective, you really get to start to see how complex it takes to be able to bring something from a concept to a notice for public rulemaking to that final rule, and how we can work together as stakeholders to get there. Okay, let's.
John's catchphrase, "a system of systems," is one that you can apply at just about any scale as part of this discussion.
No, that's a great perspective. That's a system of systems, exactly right. All right, let's shift gears and discuss an issue that pertains to all of the modes of transportation. Over the years, there have been numerous studies and research concerning risks and hazards identification regarding fatigue and human factors in transportation. Knowing that commercial air carrier work, rest, and more appropriately crew rest rules under Part 121 is foundational for all of the modes, should we expect to see rulemaking permeate through not only other parts of aviation, such as Part 135, Charter on Demand, and possibly general aviation, but also the other modes to include rail, maritime, and surface? So we'll start off with John for that.
Sure, and so I can actually be almost quick on this one because it's been happening. So, you know, I think there are fatigue related regulations throughout. So as an example, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, you know, has had provisions on unsafe driving that include allowing drivers to drive fatigued for well more than a decade now. And so a lot of these questions are fine tuning those rules and how we work through you know, particular cases, how we learn from the data that's out there and, you know, try to keep up with those areas. So, you know, one of the critical tools that FMCSA has is the hours of service rules for commercial drivers, also highly controversial rules. And then some of the tools to try to enforce that, such as electronic data logging or ELD, also controversial. So those are, you know, places where I think it's there. And the question is how you optimize that over time, how you update those to find that right balance between safety and everything else. We'll say that I think a lot of those rules and those hours of service rules came under a lot of stress during the pandemic when we were faced with both a big public health crisis, but then also natural disasters and non-natural disasters like Colonial Pipeline. And so one of the things that FMCSA, I think to their credit, has really started doing is trying to collect more data about emergency waivers and some of the impacts of those things so that we have better idea how to find that right balance between emergency situations and fatigue, as an example. I'll let Allison talk about FRA's work on fatigue issues because I think a lot of the most interesting work is happening in the rail space, but certainly was relevant to some of the labor disputes. And I think there's been a lot of focus on sick leave issues, fatigue issues in the context of those areas. And I think it's one of the reasons why this administration has focused in its discretionary grants and its other sort of programs on ensuring that there's adequate collective bargaining so that you can work through those issues. So coming back to the aviation space where you started, you know, a lot of those issues are dealt with in the collective bargaining agreements between flight attendants and airlines, pilots and airlines, and they may go above and beyond anything that the federal government may require. Certainly the details that will focus those on the particular environment. And it's been important to this administration, important to the department to support that opportunity for fair and reasonable collective bargaining to make that work. That being said, not everybody not every location has the collective bargaining agreement, and so you rely on regulation in the space. Whether we're going to specifically push fatigue rules into 135, I think not currently on the regulatory agenda, at least anything close soon, but a lot of those issues are dealt with through safety management systems. And FAA did put out a proposed rule earlier this year to expand SMS requirements to Part 135 carriers, as well as a number of other industry participants. And to the extent that fatigue management will be part of that element, it would also bring in Part 135 and other carriers into that regime. So it is something, it's still proposed. FAA took comment on that and is working on that. So I do see it as a place where, there'll be interest. FAA over time has also taken a hard look at its rules, what counts as a 135 operator, what counts as a 121 operator, or the other categories, and will make changes as data drives that need. And we do see a lot of evidence that fatigue is a major driver of safety incidents, of crashes, of fatalities. And as FAA, continues its truly heroic progress in reducing fatality and injury rates, over time and driving towards zero, that will be a place I think that, they'll continue to look at that data, make the modifications that they do. But I would certainly look at the SMS rule as a kind of critical step, not just on this issue, but the kind of broader range of safety to address, a lot of those residual safety issues that may be keeping us from where we are and zero fatalities.
Perfect. And I think that system of systems to include SMS is a good segue to turn it over to Allison for her perspective with the railroad.
Sure, and you guys have both hit on the themes that are really most active in the rail industry right now. On the non-regulatory side, because this is entirely a subject of collective bargaining, the industry, primarily the Class 1 railroads, have made amazing progress in the last 6 months, coming to agreement with their operating workforces on sick leave policies. These are not policies that really had existed for this particular population of workers in the past. It became the sort of focus of the negotiations in the fall of 2022. And because fatigue really came to the fore as an area of concern, that drove successful resolution, frankly, of the adoption of sick leave policies throughout the industry. And so on the regulatory side, FRA was involved in an effort that had been going on for several years to, first of all, incorporate safety management system principles into the approaches that we require and expect railroads to take in putting together their overarching safety programs. And then within those programs to embed fatigue risk management programs as part of their safety management approach generally. And so I think this is an example where, and as I was thinking about the presentation today on this topic in particular, I was thinking, well, this real mix of heterogeneity, given the specific factors that are unique to each mode that you need to be aware of when you're assessing the risk of fatigue for any of the modes. But at the same time, there are overarching principles and studies into human fatigue that can inform how we solve for fatigue in any particular transportation industry. So given that, the current fatigue management regimen is embedded in the requirements for organization-wide safety programs that railroads are required to maintain. So on the freight side, you have what are called risk reduction plans. On the passenger side, you've got system safety plans. And the fatigue risk management rule, which was published just about a year ago on June 13th, 2022, requires Class 1 railroads, those are the largest railroads in the industry, other kinds of railroads that FRA has deemed to have inadequate safety performance records, or railroads that provide intercity passenger or commuter rail service are the population that are required to maintain these organization-wide safety plans. And so as part of either the RRP for the freights, the risk reduction program, or the system safety program for passenger rail operators, those railroads are required to tailor a fatigue risk management plan that takes into account the hazards and factors that they have identified as unique to their particular organization and operations, and then to come up with mitigation strategies to address the fatigue risks that they have identified. And so this requires each railroad to assess the fatigue-related risks on its system and to tailor its plan to the circumstances that are specific to the territory, facilities, and operations inherent to each of those railroads. And so I see that we're running short on time, so I won't go into the weeds on that, but suffice it to say that this is a reasonably new regulatory schema for FRA, and it's something that we and the industry are putting together sort of collaboratively in order to come up with a robust means of addressing fatigue among railway workers.
No, thank you, Allison. So knowing that we have a little less than 5 minutes, we'll give 2 minutes to each of you, and we'll round it out with discussing the modern regulatory review and the update to Executive Order 12866 brought to the regulatory process under Executive Order 14094. So here's your last question. What are your thoughts on the update, and what are some of the areas that changed? So we'll start off with John in 2 minutes or less.
Thanks you, Tim. I was afraid you were going to ask us about lawyer fatigue risk management.
No, we haven't approached that one yet.
So just for everybody's benefit, this spring, OIRA did update Order 12866, which has been in place since the early 80s, and really created OIRA and created the review of regulations. I think 2 major changes that are particularly interesting to us. First, it increased the threshold for economic impact that would bring a rule in as significant and therefore require OIRA review from $100 million to $200 million indexed for inflation. That will affect some of our rules. Really only matters if you've got a rule that was between 100 and 200, or might be a little over 200 in a year or two. But that is a worthwhile change, knowing that that threshold hasn't been changed since the 80s. Inflation has changed. And I think the key point here is, like any organization, OIRA has limits. There are only so many rules it can review. There are only so many rules it can review well. And it really makes sense to kind of keep up with what's truly economically significant in that area. The second major change was that there was a catch-all in 12866 for rules that were otherwise significant because they would involve administration priorities or interfere with the rulemaking or other sort of policy initiatives of another agency. And that was something that could be invoked at a kind of desk level, at a line level in the past. Under the new rule that actually has to be approved by the administrator of OIRA, I actually think that's where a lot of the action will be. And we've seen some places where, I think it was a question mark whether a line officer might have called it significant, and they were not significant in this cases. And I think one of the things that, we certainly see, we have more than 300 rules. Our sister agencies have, many, many additional rules. You can't look at them all and still, have that focus that you need to focus on the really important ones. And I think what it will do is, do a better job, maybe not a perfect job, but a better job of making sure that OIRA is focusing on the rules that are important, which I think benefits both the non-significant rule, but also a significant rule to make sure they get the attention on powered lift, on beyond visual line of sight, on train crew, on other sort of things that they deserve.
Great, thank you, John. Allison, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll talk real fast. We perceive that EO 14094 also helps to reduce the risk or the appearance of disparate and undue influence by outside parties who want to come in and meet with OIRA. So it sets up some clear criteria for that. Excuse me. And then finally, the EO very explicitly encourages broad public participation by interested and affected parties. And so it really charges permitting agencies with listening to the broad range of stakeholder interests that may be relevant to any particular rulemaking.
Great, thank you, Allison. Well, it looks like we made it with about 8 seconds to spare. So great, the on-time departure and on-time landing, or on-time performance for the railroad industry. So with that, this was a great panel. I thank you to our panelists. Thank you, John and Allison, for taking the time. Special thanks to Ann Kiefer and the American Bar Association for coordinating this webinar, and to each of our attendees for taking the time out of your busy days today to meet with us in a sunny Northeast weather day. This concludes the seminar, and we wish each of you an enjoyable week ahead, and feel free to contact me or the ABA if you have additional questions or input. So thank you. Have a great day.
Great.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Allison. Thanks, Ann.
Bye-bye.
Bye.